It was a crime that shocked small-town Indiana, a loving family living the simple life. Ordinary people, good neighbors, friends to everyone in their close-knit community. So who would want them dead? And why? Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you've never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. Nice to finally meet you. And if you have been here before, and you've been here more than once, and you haven't subscribed, I usually don't ask you to do this, but I would love it if you were to subscribe to my channel. It just shows me that you enjoy what you're seeing and you want more of it. And if you hit the notification bell, you will find out first when I post another video. Before we get into today's case, just give me a moment of your time to thank our most loyal sponsor, PDS Debt. They have been supporting this channel since pretty much the beginning of my true crime journey, and I'm very grateful for that. So many of you already know that PDS Debt gives qualified viewers a free debt saving analysis just for completing the 30-second online debt assessment at pdsdebt.com/Kim. If you haven't done it already, I highly encourage you to do it to see where your credit is and take control of your debt. This is how I got rid of my debt, and I finally have better credit. I made a New Year's resolution that I was going to save so I can create more content for you, because that means buying more equipment to create a brand new set for my upcoming podcast channel. But of course, the expenses add up, and I know that debt and finances can be a touchy subject. But I'm sure if you're like me, you wish there was a better solution to paying off your debt. Well, PDS Debt has customized zero interest options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. Now is always the best time to get serious about a better plan to pay off your debt. You don't want to wait, especially because inflation is here to stay. The programs from PDS Debt make a real difference in your day-to-day life by saving you money the same day you get started. And like I said, PDS Debt is giving qualified viewers a free debt saving analysis just for completing this 30-second online debt assessment at pdsdebt.com/Kim. That's pdsdebt.com/Kim. And you will receive a full breakdown on how to save on interest every month and the quickest way to take care of your debt. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, this program is for you. PDS Debt rolls all of your payments into one low, zero interest monthly payment. Everyone with over $10,000 or more in debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. Bad and fair credit is accepted. Save thousands in interest and fees, pay off your debt in a fraction of the time, and take back your financial freedom today by visiting pdsdebt.com/Kim. Thank you so very much to PDS Debt for sponsoring yet another one of my videos. And I am so excited about my new YouTube channel. It's going to be a true crime video podcast. It's already up if you do want to subscribe now. There are no videos on it yet, but we're gearing up to finish my set and then do the trailer. And that will show you everything that's going to be going on that channel. If you like this channel, you're gonna like that channel. I can tell you that. And if you wanna get ahead of everyone and subscribe now, you'll be ready when the first video launches. So I will link the channel below in the description box so you can check it out. Today's case is another very sad one. Every time I hear about a family tragedy, it really tears me apart. These cases stay with me, as I'm sure they do with you as well. Today, I'm going to be introducing you to the Napier family, who are living in Laurel, Indiana. Laurel, Indiana is a town that seems to have been forgotten by time. The streets are lined with old weathered buildings, the sidewalks are cracked and uneven, but there's a sense of peace and tranquility in Laurel that's hard to find in larger towns and cities. People don't move to Laurel, Indiana. Most people are born there and never leave. It's a very small town of only about 500 residents. Most of them are either related or they have known one another their whole lives. For some people, it's all they know. And for others, it's exactly what they want: to get away from the hustle and bustle of the big city and enjoy the beautiful countryside. There are rolling hills, lush forests, and clear streams. It sounds beautiful. It's a perfect place to relax and enjoy the outdoors. If you've been to Laurel, let me know in the comments. I love that. And if you know someone who lives in Indiana, share this video with them. I'm sure they would be interested to know about something this crazy that happened in their state. The residents of Laurel are friendly and welcoming. They're always willing to lend a helping hand. There's a very strong sense of community, and everyone knows their neighbors because many families have been there for generations. The job opportunities are slim, and many of the homes in Laurel are mobile homes, which are much more affordable. This is what a street in Laurel looks like. Cozy and close-knit. From a bird's eye view, you can count how many homes are in this little township in Franklin County. And there's an even more rural area right outside the city. It's called Stipps Hill. Over on Stipps Hill Road, the homes are few and far between, and hardly any of them are permanent. Most are trailers and mobile homes that are just towed out there and placed on the land. Many people who live out in this part of the town work with livestock or are in agriculture. The Napier family was a part of the fabric of Laurel, Indiana for generations, and so were the Richardsons, two families who grew up living on the exact same street combined when a Napier and a Richardson got married to one another. Angela Richardson was born June 12, 1964, to her parents Melvin and Pauline Richardson. Angela's mother was one of 5 children, and her father, Melvin, was one of 6 siblings himself, so they both came from big families, so it's no wonder they ended up with 9 children of their own. There were 5 boys: Johnny, Jim, Jesse Ray, Philip Thomas, and Dylan, and 4 girls: Nancy, Carolyn, Teresa, and of course, Angela, who everyone called Angie. Angie's great-grandpa Lee Richardson made his home in Laurel sometime in the 1930s. Then her grandparents continued the tradition. Jesse and Hattie Mae Rose lived and died in Laurel. Hattie was 99 years old, and they had 7 children, including Melvin, which is Angela's father. So there you have it, a very rich family history in this small town. Angie grew up alongside another family, the Napiers. Roy Darrell Napier was born December 12, 1960, to his dad, Roy Donald Napier, and his mom, Shirley. The pair did end up getting a divorce, and Roy was raised by his mom and his stepfather, Albert Cummins. The Cummins family was yet another well-known family that had been in Laurel for a very long time. They were a farming family. They owned a lot of land, and Roy's mother and stepfather were hardworking people that taught him the value of discipline, work ethic, and dedication from a young age. Roy and Angie met as kids and ultimately became a couple. They fell in love, and in 1984, they got married. And just 1 year later, in April of 1985, they had their son, Joshua. They were now the Napier family. Angie and Roy were working hard to build a life for themselves and their little boy. Roy was quiet, but he was hardworking, and his main purpose was taking care of his growing family. Both Angie and Roy came from large families themselves, so they knew they would probably have more children. And just 3 years later, Angie gave birth to a little girl they named Melissa on April 11th, 1988. Now the Napiers were a family of 4, and Roy, as a carpenter, his specialty was hanging drywall. And since there weren't that many jobs in Laurel, he would take whatever he could get. He was always looking for work and willing to do anything he could to support and provide for his family. He was well known for his attention to detail, and he always got the job done. He was willing to put in extra effort to make sure he also got it done perfectly. Roy was reliable and hardworking, and when he wasn't hanging drywall, he would spend his free time watching football games and playing poker. He was a huge fan of football, and he could often be found in front of the TV cheering his favorite team for the win. His friends loved joining him, and on occasion, they would come over to play poker. Remember, there wasn't much to do. This is a small town, so these moments with friends and family were the highlight of Roy's life, especially time with his family. And they had a lot of family in Laurel, so there was always someone there to help out. Angie cared for Melissa and Josh while Roy worked. She was a good mom, and once the kids were in school, she was also a hard-working woman with a variety of jobs. Her most long-standing job was as a server at the Midtown Diner for a very long time, and she also waitressed at Fixed Restaurant. Later, she got a job at Batesville Tool and Die Shop, bringing in extra money for their family. She also spent time gardening and loved to cook and go mushroom hunting, which was a new thing for me, but in Laurel, this was quite an event. It's actually a tradition. The season starts mid-April, lasting about a month, and people go out really early in the morning. They go into forests and woods looking for delicious mushrooms. And the most popular and tasty apparently is the morel. I hope I'm saying that right. Look at these things. I've never had one, have you? They look very interesting. They don't even look like food. But it's more of a sport anyway for many residents. They even have county maps that get updated in real time online, showing where to go for the best finds. There's Facebook groups to keep track of where and when the mushrooms are popping up, and people proudly post pictures of their best discoveries. One man from the area, his name is Andrew McLeod, said that mushroom hunting as a whole is just good for the soul. It gets you out of the house when spring is flourishing and gets you kind of back in touch with yourself when you walk in the woods and find a big bag full of mushrooms. His mushroom Facebook page, called Indiana Morel Mushroom Progression, believe it or not, has over 40,000 members. And this was Angie's thing. She loved it. Looking at some of the posts on Facebook page, it's kind of like Pokemon cards in the form of stumbling upon the best mushrooms. Fans are really into this niche interest, and it's a big deal to them. So this gives you an idea of what Angie and Roy were like. Good people who worked hard, lived simply, and loved their family. 5 years after Melissa was born, Angie and Roy welcomed another son on October 7th, 1993, who they named Jacob. And as happy as they were adding another bundle of joy to their lives, it was tough. They had yet another mouth to feed, and they did the best that they could. But as the kids got older, the Napiers struggled to make ends meet. In 2004, when Josh was 19, Melissa was 16, and Jacob was 11, Roy actually turned to his mom for help. She owned a lot of land out on Stipps Hill Road, 20 acres actually. That's that more rural area I showed you. So she helped Roy and his family by getting them a trailer to put up near her house. That way, not only could they be closer to her, she could help out with the kids, and they wouldn't have to worry about renting or buying a home. Shirley Cummins was more than happy to help her son. She loved him, and she knew Angie since they had been kids, and she really liked being close to her grandchildren. It definitely took a lot of pressure off Roy and Angie, but they still had to work really hard to support themselves and their 3 children. Roy had actually been injured on the job more than once. He had a bad back. He would regularly have to seek treatment to help with the pain, and eventually he couldn't work anymore and had to go on disability and pain medication. They were all living together in a pretty small trailer out in the middle of nowhere. But you know what? It worked for them. It was all they knew. The kids all went to Laurel School, the only elementary school in the area, about 15 minutes away, down on those country roads, and then they went on to Brooksville for high school. They were growing up close to one another. However, living in such close quarters and not having much money caused many arguments in the Napier household, especially as the kids got older and they wanted to do more with their lives. This put a lot more pressure on Roy, and eventually he and Angie were fighting a lot. So Angie decided to move out and get a trailer of her own just down the road from Roy and the kids. She just really had to have her own space, but she came around almost every day to see her family. It was walking distance between the 2 trailer homes. The kids also tried their best to help. Jacob, the youngest, worked as a farmhand baling hay, and nature was his passion. He loved being outdoors, and he loved taking on new challenges. Josh, the oldest, also helped out. He was very ambitious and wanted the family to do better for themselves. He tried to help take over Roy's work and take control so that they could get ahead. Melissa was studying very hard at the time because she had dreams of becoming a CNA, which is a certified nursing assistant. She was going to school 30 minutes away out in Connorsville and spent a lot of her time with her new boyfriend, Lucas Mann, hoping that one day she would have a career and she could move out of Laurel, or at least out of the trailer that she was living in, which was about to feel even smaller. Because in 2008, Melissa and Lucas had a baby together. They named her Sierra, which is one of my sister's names, by the way, and Lucas and Melissa were determined to give Sierra the best life possible as young parents. Melissa was only 20 years old at the time. It was a lot to take on, so Melissa relied on her parents, and Angie and Roy were ecstatic when they became grandparents. They loved spending time with their granddaughter, Sierra. She brought them immense joy and filled their world with a new purpose. As things seemed to be falling apart around them, Sierra was the glue that was holding the Napier family together. Now Angie was coming around. She was staying longer so she could spend time with little Sierra. However, over the years, Angie and Roy, they just were not able to repair their relationship, and they separated. Surprisingly, when they separated, their relationship improved, and they realized they were better as friends, and they formed a healthy friendship. Angie felt comfortable coming to the trailer and visiting with Roy and her family. But a couple years later, Angie began dating a man named Jim Bilson. He was from Decatur County, and eventually she moved in with him, and this was almost 3 hours away. However, she still came by Roy's to visit her kids whenever she could. It was something that her boyfriend Jim wasn't a huge fan of. He knew how much Roy and Angie fought, and he really didn't like seeing Angie upset. He understood she wanted to maintain a relationship with her family, but it was hard on Jim having to deal with the drama every time she went over there. But nothing was going to stop Angie from seeing her loved ones. She was so proud of Melissa, who had just received her CNA certification, and her sons, who had taken over providing for Roy and themselves by getting jobs of their own to help ends meet. At this point, Roy was still recovering from back injuries and remained on disability. Things weren't perfect, but they were working as good as they could be for the Napier family until late September 2011. That's when everything changed for the worst. It was September 25th, around 1:30 in the afternoon. A driver saw something in the middle of the road as he was making his way down Stipps Hill. As he got closer, he slowed down, and he was right in front of the Stipps Hill cemetery when he realized it was a little girl. She was walking in the middle of the road all by herself. He pulled over to the side of the road to make sure she was okay and to look for any adults. But she was all alone, disheveled and crying, and it looked like she was covered in blood. Of course, this was a shock. The driver did not know what was going on. Why was this little girl there? Where were her parents? So he asked her, and that's when she said, "My mommy is dead." Wow, this whole scene is just haunting. A little girl walking next to a cemetery all alone, covered in blood, and telling a complete stranger that her mom is no longer alive. He called 911, and here's that call now.
There's a little girl walking down Stipps Hill by the cemetery, and she claims her mom's dead, and she said something about Susie. We'll get someone up there as quick as we can.
Well, this is a small town, as we know. This is the only road to get in and out of this area, and it doesn't take long for a passerby to stop and see what's going on. Eventually, the little girl is identified as 4-year-old Sierra Mann, the daughter of now 23-year-old Melissa Napier, and granddaughter to Angie and Roy. Her great-grandmother, Shirley Cummins, Roy's mom, who owns the land in this area, is alerted that her great-granddaughter was wandering alone down the street. So, of course, she races over there before the police even arrive. And she is shocked. First, by the fact that her great-granddaughter is all alone walking down this country road. She could have easily been killed by a car or wandered into the woods never to be seen again. She's holding little Sierra. She's rocking her, comforting her, and asking what happened. What she tells her great-grandma is even more shocking. She tells her that her mommy was killed and her grandma and grandpa. Shirley can't believe what she's hearing. This would mean her son was dead, and so was his wife. How? What is going on? Is this little girl telling the truth, or is she confused by what she saw? Why was she left all alone? There were so many questions, and now the police are on the scene trying to make sense of it all. They were told that the little girl lived in a trailer at 24015 Stipps Hills Road. Shirley explains it's right in the back of her home, so officers make their way down there. You can see what this trailer looks like. You can only see a little portion of it sticking out from the brush. The responding officers look inside the small trailer, and they can already see they're going to need backup, including a homicide detective. So they called up the Indiana State Police for help. Meanwhile, they canvassed the outside of the trailer to make sure the perpetrator had not stayed unseen and to see if anyone else needed help. The officers wanted to confirm that there was no one else in danger. As they were making their way around the outside of the trailer, they spot a man walking right nearby. So they ordered him to stop right there, but to their surprise, he didn't, and he ran. This is a highly wooded area. This man was running as fast as he could right into the woods and out of sight. He was too fast for the police because it seemed like he knew this area very well, more than the cops did, so they were not able to catch him. Who was he, and why would he be running from them like this? He had to be involved in some way, and they were desperate to find him. They were frantically looking for clues, and that is when they realized this man left his truck behind as he fled. Police get the license plate, and they run it in their database. It comes up as belonging to a man named Dustin Lane, a local to the area, so officers wondered, why Dustin would be running and what the connection would be to this case. He is their main focus at this point, and it takes about 30 minutes for the officers and the personnel to get to the scene. Before long, there were at least 5 other cop cars on the premises. The residents seeing this, seeing all these officers racing down their small country road, definitely got their attention. Neighbors were coming out. They were walking down to Roy Napier's trailer. They wanted to know what in the world was happening in their small, sleepy town. What would be causing this much commotion? They thought whatever it was, it had to be pretty bad. When Sergeant Jerry Gooden from the Indiana State Police arrived, he was made aware that there was more than one person deceased inside the trailer. As he got closer, he peered into a window just to take a look, and he immediately called in crime scene technicians and more homicide investigators. They didn't know what they were going to be walking into, but what they did know was that this was a very bloody scene, and they didn't want to risk disturbing any evidence. They needed the right team to conduct a proper investigation. As the Indiana State Police and the crime scene technicians are making their plan to go inside the trailer, the local police set out to find Dustin Lane, the man who ran into the woods. Now officers are taping off the perimeter and preparing to make entry. They felt very uneasy. They knew that there had been a man on the scene who got away. At any moment, they could be in grave danger. He could be armed, he could be hiding nearby. So they had officers stationed around the trailer as investigators made their way to assess the situation. Detective Mr. Tracy Rothling was one of the first to step inside the trailer. The first thing he saw was red. There was blood everywhere. He described it as a river of blood, and this is a very small space where the bodies lie lifeless. 2 of them could be seen in the middle of the living room right when you step through the trailer door, and then another 2 just feet away. 2 men and 2 women covered in blood, hardly recognizable. It was complete carnage, and many of the investigators had never seen anything like this before. Wanda Lee, the Franklin County coroner, was also on the scene, and she couldn't believe what she was looking at. She said this was beyond normal for what this community was used to. And actually, the team was in denial. They knew what they were looking at, but they didn't want to believe it was true. 4 people were dead. It was the most shocking crime scene in Laurel's history. First things first, they needed to identify the victims. And now, of course, neighbors were already outside talking to the police, saying that this was the home of Roy Napier. Shirley is there to confirm, yes, this is her son's trailer. They were also made aware that Melissa, Jacob, and Josh Napier, Roy's children, lived in the trailer as well. And if what little 4-year-old Sierra said was true, then her mother, Melissa, her grandma, Angie, and Roy Napier were among the victims. But of course, this was just a preliminary identification. This was not a formal confirmation of who was inside. That would have to come later during the autopsy. Teresa Richardson, Angie's sister, is now there talking to the police, asking what happened and if her sister was okay. No one was able to reach Angie on her cell phone, and so much was happening. Investigators hadn't even had a chance to truly assess the scene inside of this trailer. The bodies were scattered all around the small main living area, among other items that were strewn all over the place. It was completely ransacked. There were wallets that were opened up, the contents were removed, purses were inside out, everything was torn apart inside, as though someone was looking for something, for money or other valuables, all of it now blood-soaked. Drawers were gone through, the victims' pockets were turned inside out as they lie on this blood-covered carpet next to their broken and trashed belongings. There were empty food containers, prescription pill bottles, newspapers, magazines, TV remotes, baby toys, and shell casings. It was hard to tell what was evidence of a crime or what were just everyday ordinary items. But investigators are combing through the trailer, collecting anything of significance, and that is when an officer comes in and tells them, "You're going to have to stop what you're doing and follow me outside." That's when they were alerted to blood outside of the trailer home in the grass. Investigators are stunned. Was this the trail to the killer? It led away from the trailer, so they're carefully following each droplet, streak, and smear until they see yet another body outside on the ground. A 5th person deceased. They were lying face up. They were beaten until they weren't even recognizable. It's almost like they didn't have a face, and they were blood-soaked from the waist up to the top of their head. It appeared to be another adult male. This was not someone who did this to themselves. He was not the perpetrator that ran from this scene after committing the crimes against the 4 other individuals inside the trailer. But could someone inside have done this to this man and the other 3 and then taking their own life? They're back in the trailer trying to locate a firearm, since it appears that all of the victims had been shot, among other injuries. They were told that Roy and his 3 children, like I said, Josh, Jacob, and Melissa, lived there. This was most likely Josh Napier, Roy's eldest son. But why would someone want to harm this family? Well, once they took the 5th victim's wallet out of his pants pocket, they realized they were wrong. This wasn't a Napier lying on the ground outside the trailer. It was a man named Henry Smith. His wallet hadn't been taken. His pockets weren't turned inside out. It didn't look like he had been robbed like the others. And right next to his body was a cell phone, which was collected as evidence. Although the area around Henry's body was completely soaked with blood, this phone was completely clean. It's as though somebody had taken it, cleaned it off, and then placed it near the body. The battery was also dead, so they couldn't gather any more information from it. They sent it to the crime lab along with all the other evidence for forensic examination. The weird thing they noticed was that no other cell phones had been located at the scene inside the trailer or outside. Pretty much everyone had a cell phone on them those days, so this was very odd, so they took note of it. They still wanted to rule out the chance that one of the deceased individuals inside the trailer was the killer. They looked all around trying to find a gun near any of the bodies, thinking that this could have possibly been a dispute that ended with one of them taking the lives of the others and then turning the gun on themselves. Perhaps one of the men was Lucas Mann, Melissa's boyfriend, the father of little Sierra. They just weren't sure. Anything was possible, but ultimately they were only able to find shell casings from a .38 caliber. No weapon was found on the scene. So they ruled all 5 deaths homicides. This was a massacre. This meant the killer was on the loose with 5 people already dead, a number they had never seen at a crime scene like this before. They wondered if there were more to come. Around 3 hours after the murders, the word was out. With cop car after cop car racing down these small, quiet streets, people started to wonder. And there was a local gathering spot in town called Pavy's. It's a grocery store and a gas station all in one. It's where the locals go to get all their necessities, including the local gossip. And that is exactly what it was at this point. Pure speculation. Everyone had their own version of what they said they thought they heard or saw happened. There was one thing that all the stories had in common: multiple murders, specifically a family. That is what rocked this community, hearing that a family of ordinary people just like them were taken out one by one in their home. It was truly unreal to them. This could happen to any of them. And this was a community known to be loving. They valued family, and they were known for happier and simpler things like little concrete chickens out in the front of their local downtown storefronts and canoe races, or its New Year's Day polar bear plunge, where brave locals jump into the ice-cold river, sometimes raising money for charities. This wasn't a town known for mass murder. Who would do such a thing? Not one of them, that's for sure. It couldn't be one of them. So who was it? Maybe it was the man who just happened to come looking for police. Yes, a man comes up to the roadblock on Stipps Hill Road. He's covered in bloody scratches and bruises all over his face and arms, and he's asking to talk to police. Lo and behold, this is Dustin Lane. Remember him? The man who left his truck behind and ran from the cops just a few hours earlier, right when they arrived at the crime scene? It's actually very common for a perpetrator to come back to the scene of the crime, so authorities are on high alert. First thing he said was that he wasn't involved in anything that happened at the crime scene, but the cops aren't buying it. They're carefully examining him, his body language, and of course, his injuries. What's that all about? And he explains all that is from when he ran from them. So they're like, okay, well, why would you run in the first place if you weren't involved? And even more questionable was the fact that he was at the scene of a mass murder. So he explains, I was hired by Roy Napier, I was doing some work for him. I was just dropping by to pick up what I was owed. Then he adds, I have a criminal record and I was worried that you would arrest me thinking I had something to do with it, so I got scared and I ran. He said he didn't even know a murder occurred. He didn't go inside the trailer or anything. But then later, he heard from the people in town about what happened, and he made sure to come back so he could clear his name. Police questioned him for quite some time. They realized, he did come forward on his own. He was very distressed by what they told him happened inside that trailer, and he seemed genuine about his story. So they released him, but not without getting all of his information, because he wasn't officially ruled out. No one could be until they could confirm through enough evidence who had done this. But they let him go until they had more information. Besides, they had another name on their list, and I'm about to tell you who and why. The investigation at the trailer went on for hours into the night and the early morning, and all 5 victims were finally transported to the Institute of Forensic Science in Indianapolis, Indiana, where autopsies were being conducted. And each one was formally identified. One clue stood out at the crime scene: a bloody shoe print, one that led in the direction of going out of the trailer. They believed at this time that whoever committed these murders was wearing DC brand skate shoes. Remember those? I don't know if you guys still wear them. I know I did when I was younger. They have a distinctive sole with a DC logo imprinted on the bottom near the heel. They look like this. That's exactly what they found in a bloody shoe print left at the scene. Not only that, in the back bedroom, investigators find something very telling. It's an application for a restraining order that had been filled out by none other than Roy Napier. And guess who it was against? His own son. His eldest, Josh, the 26-year-old. Roy had gone down to the courthouse, and this was just a week prior to the murders. He had the intention of keeping his son away from him. It was clear Roy was in fear of Josh, and Josh was not one of the victims found inside the trailer. Family feuds are known to lead to violence and sometimes murder. So Josh is their number one suspect. Investigators have a lot of people to start questioning, starting with the Napier family and then close friends and neighbors, but that would have to wait because it was in the middle of the night. By the next day, residents were even more aware of what was going on out on Stipps Hill Road. More neighbors had gathered around. There were news vans lining the streets. This story was huge. Even though the victims had not been identified, people had already been telling the media who they thought had been killed. They were confident, saying they knew who was in that trailer. A neighbor named Erica Boyer, she was interviewed as she stood outside trying to get a look at what else was going on at the trailer. She told the news that she knew the victims. It had to be Angie and Roy Napier, their 23-year-old daughter Melissa, and their 17-year-old son Jacob. Lastly, the man outside that was found dead, that was 43-year-old Henry Smith. She said he lived right across the street in an RV hooked up to his mother's shed.
While many details have not been confirmed by police in Franklin County, Indiana, rumors are swirling tonight as residents in the small town of Laurel are trying to understand why 5 people were shot and killed.
Shock. I mean, I can't explain it in words. I mean, I don't know.
Erica Boyer says she's a friend of all 5 victims. We're learning from investigators that on this property off Stipps Hill Road is where a man, his ex-wife, and their 2 adult children were found dead. A 5th man, possibly a family friend, was also found shot and killed not far from the other 4 victims.
They're really good people. They're your ordinary neighbors. They help you out in any way that they can, do whatever they could for you.
The investigators would not confirm any of this. They didn't say whether it was true or not, or that the shooter was not one of the victims. They were very tight-lipped about this investigation because it was still open. They were also still waiting on the autopsy report. 4 had been completed, and there was 1 left, and the results were expected the very next day on Tuesday. Meanwhile, the investigators can use all the info that they can get, and that's what they set out to collect. They speak with Roy's mother, Shirley Cummins. They also wanted to connect with her to make sure that little Sierra was okay. She was safe, and now she was in good hands with her great-grandma Shirley. And then she goes on to explain the situation over at her son's house. She said Roy, Melissa, Josh, and Jacob had been living there until last week. That's when Roy kicked Josh out. They had been arguing for quite some time, and she said that Josh wanted to control everything, including the money coming in. He wanted to run the household. She said that he was aware his father was injured and not in the best health, so he was taking advantage of the situation. But Roy finally had enough. That is what led him to file the restraining order, and the ex parte court date was set for that week, the week of the murders. She believed Josh could have held a grudge against his father and been jealous about his siblings being allowed to live in the trailer, and he had to move out and live with his girlfriend, Sandra McDaniel. This was a huge red flag. They needed to track him down as soon as possible. Shirley also helped investigators with information about Henry Smith. She explained, Henry was a very close family friend. They knew him all of his life. He didn't have many other friends, so he spent a lot of time hanging out with Roy, just coming over, socializing, hanging out with the kids, helping out, doing things around the house. And she said she didn't think he had anything to do with the murders. And it turned out Sierra had told her great-grandma that Henry helped her. Maybe that's why he was outside. He was trying to save this little girl. Of course, they couldn't be sure, but at this point, they were sure of the identities of the victims. Coroner Wanda Lee had finally made a statement. They were indeed 50-year-old Roy Napier, his estranged wife, 47-year-old Angela Napier, their 23-year-old daughter, Melissa Napier, the mother of little 4-year-old Sierra, and her 17-year-old brother, Jacob Napier, who would have turned 18 in just a few weeks on October 7th. Angie's sister, Teresa, was called with the news, and it was unbelievable and heartbreaking. Not only did she lose a sister, but she helped raise Angie's children since they were just born. So the loss was unbearable and senseless. Police asked her if she had any idea who would do this to her sister and her family. She said she knew that Angie and Roy would fight a lot, but she didn't think it would ever lead to anything like this. She didn't know who could hate them this much, enough to end their lives. It just didn't make sense because they were just ordinary people. Henry Smith's mother, Jewel Compton, was notified of her son's murder, and she couldn't hold back her tears. She told investigators that Henry left their home that morning and headed across the way to Roy's, but she said, quote, he never made it back. And tears were running down her face. She wanted to know how her son died, and the investigators gave her the horrific news that he had been shot. But they did not know what the official cause of death was yet. They were still waiting. At this point, officials put the Laurel school on lockdown that morning. It's a preschool through 8th grade, and that was only 10 miles away from the crime scene, so they just wanted to make sure that everyone was safe and that no one else would be harmed. Since they literally didn't have anyone in custody at this point, the lockdown was just a precaution. The principal told the parents that were dropping off their kids that they would be safe on campus, but they wouldn't be doing anything like outdoor recess because they wanted them to be safe. The town was louder and busier than usual because all of the news crews and their vans were parked all over the place, at the courthouse, at the trailer, and all up and down the roads. They were questioning anyone and everyone who would speak to them because they just had to get their story.
5 people shot to death in one tri-state community. Residents in Franklin County, Indiana are now on alert, wondering if the shooter is still out there. 9 News reporter Bill Price is live in Laurel, Indiana. He has the latest on the investigation. Bill, what do we know right now?
Well, Tanya, what I can tell you is residents up and down Stipps Hill Road here in Laurel, Indiana, say they're both shocked and scared after learning that 3 men and 2 women were found shot to death around 2 trailer homes on Sunday. Now, rumors about that shooting and what led up to it have been flying throughout this small community ever since. Now, today we also got our very first closer look, you might say, at the trailer where Indiana State Police and the Franklin County Sheriff's Office found 4 people shot to death around one trailer. It's deep in the woods off Stipps Hill Road. Another man was found dead near a second trailer and shed that's across the road from the entrance to the first trailer. Now, officers were led to the scene by a child that some neighbors say was a 4-year-old girl who was found wandering along this road by herself early Sunday afternoon. Some residents, the ones who were able to speak to us or willing to speak to us on camera, say they decided to stay home from work today to protect their families and their property.
You never know. You know, we never had to lock our doors here before, and everybody knows everybody around here, so, I mean, and like I said, the people down the road, there was fighting all the time there, and it just makes you sick to your stomach.
The community wanted answers. Franklin County Sheriff Ken Murphy told the media, quote, "We've gotten a lot of leads, and that's what's going to solve it. People out in the community that may have seen something, please give us a call," end quote. Indiana State Police Sergeant Jerry Gooden added, "Officers have searched everywhere and will continue to look for people today, but there's not an organized manhunt underway. The problem is we don't know who we're looking for. end quote. And it makes sense. You can't have a manhunt without the man. He did let them know that they were continuing to search and that they had control over the crime scene and the surrounding area. It was true. They were looking into all kinds of people, and one of them was Josh Napier. They didn't have to go far to track him down because his girlfriend Sandra McDaniel's house wasn't far from Josh's father's trailer. They surrounded the place and they knocked on the door looking for Josh. Sandra answered and told them she didn't know where Josh was. And as a result, they put out a bolo, a be on the lookout. This included a description of Josh, his height, his weight, that he was a white male, that he had brown hair, along with other distinguishing features like the fact that he had a beard and what type of vehicle he drove. Tips were coming in, and one was from Henry Smith's aunt, Evelyn Renfro. She lived nearby. She said she heard gunshots around noon on Sunday, but her and her family were working with their livestock, so she couldn't just up and leave to go check on it. Considering the driver saw Sierra out on the road near the cemetery around 1:20 p.m., it made sense that the murders most likely happened not too much earlier. Who knows how long it took this poor little girl to wander by herself out to that location, but it's usually only a 3-minute walk for an adult, but this is a child. Nobody knew how long she'd been left alone after her family was killed or what she saw. And that is really sad to think about. Thinking was something they were doing a lot of in this community, and the investigators were as well. They started to think about the possibility that they could find Josh dead too. If it wasn't him that committed this crime, maybe someone was out there trying to make sure that all the Napiers were dead. They were even more eager to locate him. As news of the 5 murders were spreading through the small town of Laurel, the Napier family was inundated from texts and calls from extended family members. Zach Napier was one of the cousins, and he received a single text, and that was all it took for him to race to the scene. The text said, "Melissa was shot, and so were other family members. You have to get down here." So he did. When Zach arrived at the crime scene, he was pushing through people, pushing through the crowd. He's like, "That's my family." And that's when they informed him and the rest of his family that they were trying to locate Josh. No one knew where he was, and they had just put out an APB for him, so Zach promised he would help the family search. They were huddled together, they were grieving, they were holding on to one another, they were praying. They wanted to find their missing family member, and soon. The family was overwhelmed with sadness and confusion, trying to comprehend this horrific tragedy, holding their breath as they were waiting for news of their loved one. Would they find Josh alive? It wasn't long before another commotion was happening. It was right outside the scene. Josh himself was there. It turns out he, like many others, were informed about what happened to his family, that they were dead. And he ran right up. He was shocked. He was distressed. He was asking for police. He wanted answers. He tells them, "I heard about this on social media." Like, nobody actually was able to reach out to him, know his number. That amazed me, that somebody had to find out about their family through a Facebook post. It was clear that Josh needed support, but he was also their prime suspect. So they asked him to step aside, and they needed to question him. He did as they said. He was out in the back of a squad car. They told him, "You're not under arrest, but you are being detained for questioning." First, they informed him that his mother, his father, and his 2 siblings had been killed, along with a family friend, Henry Smith. Josh was visibly shaken. He began to break down in tears, and as much as officers wanted to give him some time, they also needed information. Finally, once he calmed down and was able to pull it together enough, they spoke to him, and he admits, "I didn't have the best relationship with my dad." The officers asked Josh if he knew why his father would have gone so far as to file a restraining order against him, and at that point, Josh was taken aback by their question. He was almost insulted and confused. He told them, "I have no idea why my dad would do that." He said he knew his family was struggling, they were going through a rough patch, but he emphasized that he was not the cause of the family problems. It was actually the disputes between his parents. If anyone was to blame, it was them. So here he is acting like he had no idea that his dad had a restraining order. It takes a lot to get to that point, and yet he's blaming it all on his mom and dad, who are now both dead. But it wasn't Angie that was on that restraining order application. It was Josh that Roy had an issue with. But Josh goes on to explain that Roy didn't like the fact that Angie had moved on. He didn't like the fact she was living with her boyfriend, Jim. That Jim and Roy hated one another. And anytime Angie would come by, both Roy and Jim would become irate. Jim didn't want Angie over at Roy's, and Roy hated the fact that Angie had left the family and left him and went to move so far away. He was really mad that she left, especially for Jim, because according to Josh, Jim had a deep-seated hatred of Roy. And countless times, he had tried to prevent Angie from visiting the trailer and spending time with her family. Josh appeared to be honest about what he was telling them. He also helped them link a clue that they found at the crime scene. When they arrived and they cordoned off the area, a car remained parked on the street nearby, and no one came to get it. So when they ran the plates, they came back to a James Bilson. No one knew his connection, and he was on their list as a person of interest, but now they knew exactly how he was connected. It was Jim's car. He was Angie's new man, and it sounded like he wasn't a big fan of Roy. But did he hate him enough to carry out such a heinous crime? Well, it's taken much less. So the answer is yes, it is possible. Until the killer was in custody, everyone was a suspect in the murders of the Napier family and Henry Smith. Even Josh was still a suspect, although he did tell investigators that he'd been away from his parents' home and at Sandra's all night and morning. However, he said he wished he had been there. He wanted to be at that trailer when the killer came through the door, because then he would have possibly been able to stop him from doing this to his family. He said his only concern was finding out who had done this. The problem is, the detectives have a keen eye for detail, and something stuck out to them. Josh's shoes. They were DC skate shoes. Maybe it wasn't just wishful thinking. Maybe he was in his dad's trailer that day, and he could have stopped the killer because the killer was him. Damn. I can't even imagine the adrenaline that would be pumping through these investigators, realizing they're looking at the exact same type of shoes that were left in that shoe print in blood at the crime scene. They don't let Josh leave until he hands over his shoes, and he's confused. He's like, why do you need my shoes? And they're like, you know what? It's standard procedure. We just need to give them a look. They were also going to take a deeper look into Josh and his alibi and his background. They began to trail him wherever he went. They weren't done with him yet, not at all. But they let him go. They wanted to see what he would do next while they look into their next lead, Angie's boyfriend, Jim. Several days after the murders, the coroner released more information. The final cause of death would be 6 weeks away. But according to the news, the coroner stated that 47-year-old Angie Napier had a gunshot wound to the head and blunt force trauma to the face and head. 50-year-old Roy had a gunshot wound to the head area, execution style. So did 23-year-old Melissa, 17-year-old Jacob, and 43-year-old Henry Smith. However, Henry had been severely beaten on the head and the face and shot in the chest. Angie and Henry were beaten in addition to being shot, whereas the other victims were not beaten. That seemed to be interesting to investigators. They wondered why those two were singled out and given more severe injuries. At this point, more tips are coming in. They don't know which were important and which were just baseless assumptions. For example, a couple neighbors came forward saying that there were drug deals going on at Roy's trailer. A woman named Deborah, who can see Roy's trailer from her greenhouse at her Pretty Petals florist shop nearby, said she complained frequently to the police that there were drug dealers in the area, specifically at that mobile home that Roy owned. However, she could not give authorities any specific information, but as they questioned other neighbors, even Angie's sister Teresa blamed the massacre on drugs. She didn't go into detail, but she simply said she knew drugs had to be involved. The thing is, there were no illegal drugs found at the crime scene. Did the killer take them with him? And what kind of drugs are we talking about? It didn't look like there was like a grow operation going on or a meth lab. So they just weren't sure if this was the truth or judgment from the community. The Napiers definitely weren't well off. And you'd think if they were drug dealers or there were a drug-related crime going on, they would be living a much different lifestyle. But they did keep this information in their mind and they continued with the investigation. Even more information comes in. And now this time it's from the crime lab. Remember that cell phone that they found at the crime scene near Henry's body? It turns out it belonged to Angie Napier. The SIM card had been removed and all of the text messages had been deleted, and that's weird. It was also weird that it was found right near Henry, Recall, those were the two people that had more injuries. So they do conduct an extraction on the phone, and they're able to at the very least, get into Angie's contact list. They were hoping to track down the numbers of the other phones of the victims so that they could locate each and every cell phone. They were thinking that maybe one of the phones was in the possession of the killer. There is no contacts in this phone for Jacob or Roy. Maybe she knew the numbers by heart, but there was a contact listed for Melissa Napier. So they give this number to the U.S. Marshal's office because they had the technology to trace the phone. But this would take some time. It's a lengthy process to get the information connected to the right providers and then gain access to their records, including the data showing which towers the phone pinged off of and whether it was still on and being used so they could track it down. Meanwhile, they want permission to speak to the one person who witnessed these murders firsthand and had already provided them with clues from the very beginning. 4-year-old Sierra Mann. She witnessed her own mother being murdered, even told her great-grandmother and the driver that found her that her mommy was shot. So this poor little thing knew what a gun was and what it done to people she loved. I can't begin to imagine the trauma that had to have caused such an innocent little child, but they were desperate for anything that could help solve this case. That's a delicate situation to question a child, especially one this young. And that's for many reasons, not just because it can be difficult on their psyche, but because the information isn't always accurate. But so far, she's been right about who had been murdered and how. So they asked family members who were taking care of Sierra at the time if she had told them anything. What they were told was not what they expected to hear. Not at all. Investigators were informed that Sierra had not said too much about that horrific Sunday afternoon, but when prompted, she said, Jim did it. Wow. Now that's a bombshell for police. They knew Jim's car was outside, and he apparently had disdain and resentment towards Roy Napier. He prevented Angie from going over to see her own family, but hearing this, that Sierra actually pointed the finger at Jim as the killer, they needed to pay James, who's known as Jim Bilson, a visit, and fast. So they come up with a plan. They're going to act as soon as the sun is about to come up. They station police outside Jim's house, and around 6 a.m. that next morning, they're knocking on his door announcing themselves as detectives from the Indiana State Police. He agrees to speak with them. He lets them inside, so they ask him if he has any idea why they're there. He stated that he was aware there was some kind of murder that happened out in Laurel, but he doesn't know specifics. That's when they inform him that not only had Roy Napier and his 2 children been gunned down with a friend, but his girlfriend Angie was among the list of victims. They watched Jim's reaction very carefully. He stood there in shock. He was speechless. His reaction looked genuine. It was an appropriate way for someone who had just been informed of this to act. He really seemed like he was unable to understand what they just told him and believe it would be true. He asked them if they were sure that it was Angie, and they confirmed they were sure. They wanted to know if Angie had been living with Jim, and he said yes, she was. They asked why his car would be at Roy's house, and he let them know that he let Angie borrow his car that day. He didn't know where she was going, but he told her she could use it. He added that he didn't like when Angie went over to Roy's because it worried him. He would worry about her. He said it wasn't safe for her to be there, and investigators want to understand Jim's supposed fears. Why was Angie not safe? And he tells them he constantly pleaded with her not to go to that trailer in Laurel, but she just wouldn't listen. He said no matter what he said, she wouldn't listen to him and wouldn't stop making trips over there. But family meant everything to her. Nothing he said, and no amount of begging, would stop her from spending time with her kids. Even if she didn't get along with Roy, and it made Jim mad. But Jim said it was far, and if anything were to happen to her, he wouldn't be there to help her. But what? What did he think would happen to her? Well, what he says next brings investigators back to the rumors that have been swirling around. Remember those assumptions that Roy might have been dealing drugs? Well, Jim says he didn't want Angie over there because there were strange people going in and out of that place all the time. Roy, who had been on disability on account of his back injury, had gotten so desperate that he began selling his prescription pain pills, specifically OxyContin. They asked him, "How do you know this?" He said Angie told him. So this means he did not see it with his own eyes. Was this a true story or another rumor between an ex and the new man in her life? They probed Jim even further, asking, what's your relationship with Roy? He said, I don't like him. I don't like him at all. And he admitted he hated Roy and that he didn't have anything to do with his murder because he would never do that. He would never harm Angie or her children, but he did not like him at all. They run a background check on Jim. He doesn't have a criminal record. His story is very convincing, and he seems forthcoming with all the information. He also says he has an alibi, that he was at a barbecue that day. He provides names, telephone numbers of all the people that were there so they could confirm that Jim was with him on the day of the murders. Cops called them all. They all confirmed Jim was with him that day, and it was far enough away that he couldn't have just slipped out, committed the murders, and then came back. So they ruled Jim out for now, and they're at a dead end. This case is now garnering national attention. Of course it would. A family of 4 and their best friend murdered in their home in cold blood, execution style, with a 4-year-old escaping harm and walking along a road near a cemetery. Of course it's going to be the story nationwide. But they had no one in custody and no real suspect and no motive. The only person that would have had a motive in their mind is Josh. It's just too coincidental that he was just kicked out. His dad applied for a restraining order. The hearing was coming up. Plus, let's not forget about those DC shoes. They also know that Josh wasn't telling the whole truth. He never mentioned anything about drugs, not one word about his father selling his OxyContin pills. But this could have all been made up by Jim. They didn't know, but they needed to find out. Because it's true, there were indeed empty prescription pill bottles that were in evidence they found at the crime scene, and they were OxyContin pills. This is not a tangent. If you're not familiar, I wanted to let you know what OxyContin pills are. OxyContin is a Schedule II controlled substance. It's a narcotic. It's legally prescribed for severe pain and injuries and even cancer. But because of its euphoric effect, it's so similar to heroin that people began abusing it and using it to get high. I have to tell you this. I watched 2 insane documentaries about OxyContin, and I highly recommend them. I'm going to link them in my description box. One is called The Crime of the Century. It's on HBO. It's all about the opioid epidemic with Big Pharma at the center, specifically Purdue Pharma's aggressive promotion of OxyContin. That laid the groundwork for the entire crisis, and the other documentary is called Dope Sick. It's so good. It's on Hulu. It's based on a book written by Beth Macy, and it's all about a doctor that was manipulated into prescribing OxyContin by pharmaceutical companies and the greed that surrounded the dark side of American capitalism. Lives were hanging in the balance. The book is entitled Dope Sick: Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America. And I'm telling you, you have to watch those documentaries. And I'm also telling you this because OxyContin is no joke. And neither is the addiction that comes along with it, especially for rural areas like Laurel, Indiana. These areas are affected by addiction at a much higher rate than any other areas in the country. Drug overdose fatalities cost Indiana $1.5 billion a year. Addiction is one of the largest problems that the state faces, and it's doubled since 2010. Rural communities used to be known as great places to raise a family. You could find wholesome households and innocence. It's a place to escape crime and drugs. You would be living in communities off the beaten path because they're safer, but not anymore. So what happened? It started with the recession in 2008, and that's the same year that Roy's family had the new addition, little Sierra. And that's just a few years after they were struggling really hard to make ends meet. Roy and his family were forced to move onto his mom's land because of the lack of jobs in rural areas like Laurel. It makes it nearly impossible for people to improve their quality of life, and it's a vicious cycle because the jobs are not available in these areas, and if they are, they usually involve manual labor. They cause injuries like the ones that Roy sustained. This means people seek medical attention and they don't want to be out of work because they need the money. So instead, they don't address the injury. They're prescribed pain meds to get them through the day. And over time, the injuries only get worse, making it harder for them to work and recover. A lot of rural doctors are also to blame. They're not exactly getting a lot of business out there. So if they can get a patient on a medication that they will need, i.e. that they will become addicted to, then they'll keep coming back. Not to mention the deals and the kickbacks that these doctors get for pushing drugs like OxyContin from the pharmaceutical companies. That's where greed kicks in. And not all doctors are like this, but it's a big part of the problem. Now, because this is such a small town, everyone knows one another, and that means they share with one another, even their pills, either giving them away or selling them as a favor to their friends. But over time, this can be another source of income. Every little bit counts, right? So selling a few pills here and there can add an extra meal on the table for a rural family. And that one meal can make such a difference. It would make perfect sense if it were true that Roy Napier began to sell his OxyContin pills. The fact that they were missing is telling. Maybe Josh knew, and when his grandma Shirley stated that he wanted control, maybe that meant control over the drug business that his dad started. And that is what led to all this. But when the results came back from Josh's shoes, they didn't find any blood on them whatsoever. But maybe he had more than one pair of the same kind. Right now, they need to get to the bottom of the OxyContin situation. The one that Josh seemed to conveniently leave out when he was telling them about his family situation. They call him back into the station and tell him they know he didn't tell them the truth about his father. They say, "We know your dad was selling drugs." And Josh is kind of caught off guard. He says, "My dad wasn't a drug dealer. He did occasionally sell some of his prescription pills for extra cash," but he admits that this is why him and his dad didn't get along. Josh didn't agree with it. He didn't like what his dad was doing. But by that point, it was the only way that Roy felt that he could support his family. So he wasn't going to let Josh stand in his way. They asked Josh if there were any questionable people that Roy sold pills to. Anyone that would want to rob him, or that Roy maybe owed some money, something like that. And he said, well, there were definitely a lot of different people over the years, but as far as anyone standing out, there was a regular buyer, especially a guy that had been coming over more and more recently to get Oxy. But he doesn't know his name because it's not something he likes to involve himself in. But he does tell the investigators that this guy lives with his mom in a mobile home, and his mom goes by the name Blondie. They're like, okay, that's not really solid information. And they ask him, okay, well, what's the address? He says, I don't know, but I've been there a few times when my dad dropped off pills. So he says he can take them to where the home was located. So they hop in a cruiser and they let Josh lead the way. As they call back to the station to have an officer run this address through their system, one of the cops recognizes the name Blondie. He tells investigators that her name is really Kimbyrleigha Richardson, and she has a son named David Eisen. What stood out to me was her last name. That's the same last name as Angie's maiden name, Richardson. Well, the name David Eisen is what stood out to investigators. They had heard this name many times before. Recently, in May of that year, just a few months earlier, there was an armed robbery at a drugstore. The robber tried to break the glass at the desk of the pharmacy area, and he ended up getting injured pretty badly. His blood ends up on one of the pharmacists that were working that day trying to defend themselves. They had the blood tested, and a DNA contributor came back as David Eisen. They had a warrant out for his arrest, but they were not able to locate him the last few months, and this robbery had gone unsolved. Now they were being told that he lived at this address that Josh had just brought them to. He had been robbing a pharmacy for pills, and now Josh is connecting him to Roy as a buyer of his prescription OxyContin, a man they know is willing to go to extreme measures to get his drug fix. They do a background check on David Eisen, and he has over 20 felony convictions, with his crimes going all the way back to 1999. He was actually supposed to be on probation at the time the murders occurred. This was on 3 different criminal charges: for burglary, armed robbery, and counterfeiting. His probation wasn't even supposed to end until 2020, but he had violated his probation a number of times in the past, and he had spent most of his adult life in prison. This was a bad guy. They had to make sure they arrested him, if not for any connection with the murder, but just a simple fact to get this guy off of the streets and prove that he was responsible for that robbery of the pharmacy. So they get a search warrant for the home where he's said to be living. As they're waiting for a judge to sign off on it, that cell phone data comes back on Melissa's cell phone. It pinged 5 hours after the murders. It was around 6 p.m. when it pinged off a tower located right near the same location that Josh said David Eisen lived. This is when I get excited because I want to get these things solved, and when all these things connect and they just start to make sense, I always imagine what it must feel like for investigators who are going through it in the moment. You could also stand in Blondie's yard and literally see the cell tower above the trees. They thought it was way too coincidental not to be connected, but they had to make sure. They had to have concrete evidence linking this man to the murders. When they got the search warrant in hand on September 28th, 3 days after the murders, they weren't quick to just show up at Blondie's doorstep. They needed to make sure they had this scene secured. So they sent an emergency response team there. They strategically placed them all around in bushes around the house, the wooded area, out of sight, but able to see everything that was going on. That way they could respond quickly in case things got out of hand. We're talking about a man who may have massacred 5 people, including a family. What's to stop him from firing at police or himself? They sat and waited for 6 hours without moving. At 6 p.m., they were finally ready because they saw some movement at the front door. 2 people were coming outside. The homicide investigators are contacted right away. They're notified that a person matching David's description, along with a female, are exiting the home and getting ready to get inside of a car in the driveway. The commanding officer gave orders for the 2 individuals to be stopped at all costs. An undercover vehicle was closely following behind David's car, and they follow him to the nearby Pavy's gas station. And as soon as David parks and he starts to get out, the police jump out. They have their guns drawn. They tell him, put your hands out the window and don't move. Both David and the passenger do exactly what they're told. Their arms are hanging out the windows. The officers move in. They open the doors and they drag both of them out of the car. They separate them and put them in different squad cars. As they're sitting there looking at David Eisen, it's extremely obvious to them he's wearing a fake beard. They called it absurd looking. It must have been something out of like a kid's costume package, something like one of the Santa Claus types of beards, except it was black. The ones with like the elastic band that goes around your ears. Wow. He was also wearing eyeglasses, a wig, a hat, and says his name is Tim Eisen. They're like, okay, buddy, why are you wearing a disguise? And this man actually tells investigators, there's a murderer on the loose out here, and I don't want him to see me. That's rich. It's more absurd than his fake beard. When they open his trunk, they find a loaded .380 Bersa handgun as well as a loaded AK-47 rifle. These weren't the weapons used to commit this crime, but detectives were also inside his home. And they uncovered blood-stained clothing, a cell phone who ends up belonging to Melissa Napier, and a pair of, wait for it, DC skate shoes that matched the ones that could have left the shoe print at the crime scene in blood. Who knew that those were such popular shoes in this area? But you know what? They live in a small town. There's probably like one store, like a Walmart, and they're all there for people to buy. So I guess it's not that much of a surprise. And these shoes look like they had just been washed. They're still wet, and it seems like they've been put into a washing machine. When David asked why he was being arrested, they say it's because of the robbery charges. But then they ask him about his involvement in what they had dubbed the Laurel 5 massacre. He denied even knowing who the victims were. He says, I don't know anyone in the Napier family. But David was a career criminal. He's done this many times. He sat in a police station being questioned. It was like he felt at home. He was calm and collected, and he wasn't coming off as scared or anxious. But as soon as he realized they were trying to pin those murders on him, he just stopped talking and asked for an attorney. Defense attorney John Watson was appointed to represent David Eisen, who was being held on a $5 million bond, $1 million for every life that they believe he took. They weren't able to formally charge him yet because they were still waiting on the final autopsy reports at the time, but they truly believed they had the sole person responsible for the crimes. They weren't about to rush this investigation, though. They were going to make sure they had a solid case against him. This arrest was a relief to the public, but the case wasn't closed yet. However, it was great news to Josh. His family was gone. Nothing was going to bring them back. But the fact that they had someone in custody, someone they think they have enough information and evidence on that they could connect him to the murders, that was a lot. It meant a lot. But once the residents of Laurel hear who they arrested, they weren't so quick to jump on that bandwagon and celebrate. They didn't want to say that they had the right man because he was one of their own. David Eisen is from Laurel. Remember, they said, oh no, it couldn't be one of us. It couldn't be. One resident came forward and said, I went to high school with David. He definitely doesn't seem like someone who would grow up to be a killer. So many people were just in disbelief. Just like the Napiers, David and his family had deep ties to Laurel. And because of this, there was a sense of betrayal that the brutal murderer had been one of Laurel's own. And now they wait. And while they do, time doesn't stand still for those who lost their loved ones in this horrific slaying. One person feeling the burden of the loss more than others was the sole survivor of the immediate Napier family, Joshua Napier. At only 26 years old, he's left to bury his mother, father, and the only 2 siblings he had. No one expects to outlive their whole family, especially their parents. Josh had made all the arrangements for his family's funeral and asked that any donations be given directly to the funeral expenses. Todd Funeral Center and Crematory provided generous financial assistance to Josh, helping cover the cost of his parents' and his siblings' funeral. Actually, several churches in the area offered their facilities for the funeral services of the Napier family, yet in the end, it was decided that their funeral service would take place at the Calvary Baptist Church in Connorsville. It's about 30 minutes away from Laurel. The Napier family was well known, and they were respected in the community. The funeral director expected a large turnout, and the other funeral homes would not be able to accommodate this. There would be friends and family of Melissa and Jacob, all their friends from school and college. They were all grieving their loss, not to mention Melissa's boyfriend, Lucas, all of his family, their little girl, Sierra, that was left behind. This tragedy touched so many people's lives. Calvary Baptist was large enough to accommodate the expected number of guests. It was estimated to be in the hundreds. Initially, the funeral for the Napier family was going to be held at Metamora Church of God, which also had a big enough space. However, get this. In this small town, it wasn't that much of a big surprise, but the pastor of the church, Wayne Eisen, he was the uncle of David Eisen, the prime suspect. So that was definitely a no-go. It was sad when I was reading about the accommodations that had to be made for 4 people that die at once. Organizing the funeral of the Napier family presented some unique challenges. The fact that there were 4 caskets to bring from one place to the other. Typically, a funeral home would rent hearses from others when they needed one, but they needed 4. And because of financial issues, they were not able to rent them at the time. But fortunately, there were other funeral homes that reached out and they offered their hearses. And I hadn't really thought about it, but yeah, you definitely need a vehicle that can hold a casket. They're large, they're heavy, they're cumbersome. I hadn't really realized that without a hearse, it would definitely be hard and very weird looking if some kind of other vehicle were trying to transport. And they definitely would not want the liability if anything were to happen to such precious cargo. The Napier family was buried in the same cemetery the little 4-year-old Sierra had been walking the day of the murders, the Stipps Hill Cemetery, where many of the Napier and Richardson family members were buried, including Angie's grandparents, Jesse and Hattie Mae. Residents of Laurel also attended Henry Smith's funeral at Buena Vista Southern Missionary Baptist Church. Mourners were heartbroken as they paid their respects to the 5th victim of the horrific Laurel 5 massacre. The church was filled with family, friends, and community members gathered to honor Henry's life. In the wake of the funerals for the 5 victims, murder charges were officially filed against their prime suspect, David Eisen, on October 9th, 2011, just days after Jacob Napier would have celebrated his 18th birthday had he still been alive. But David insisted he didn't act alone. Remember the woman that was with him when he was arrested? Well, he told investigators she was at the center of the whole thing. Her name? Amanda Napier. Wait a minute, I was blown away. Apparently she has no direct relation to the Napier family. She acquired the last name from her now ex-husband, Jeff Napier. Confusing, I know, but Jeff is also not directly related to Roy Napier, according to reports. He just happened to share the same last name. It's very interesting, but he told police his ex-wife, Amanda, had started dating David Eisen, and that David was dangerous. He had threatened to kill Amanda and her and Jeff's 3 children if she left him or talked to authorities after the massacre occurred. Jeff had talked to Amanda on September 27th, the day before David was arrested, and Jeff said that Amanda was terrified of David. Amanda told him that David was constantly threatening her with guns. He would point them over her head, directly at her, scream at her, even pistol whipped her once. Officers asked Jeff, who had custody of him and Amanda's children since their divorce in 2005, why he never called police when David threatened his children's lives. And he said, "I have a huge German Shepherd. He guards the house." And in his words, his home was fortified. Authorities want to look into Amanda. to see if she was indeed involved in this crime in any way. They begin to question people who knew her. A woman named Sue Durham comes forward. Her children were friends with Amanda. Amanda actually texted Sue 3 or 4 weeks before the murders, talking about the threats that David had made. She told Amanda to get out of there. And once David was arrested, Amanda actually went to Sue's the next day. And Sue said she was traumatized. She told Amanda to tell the authorities everything. Her ex-husband Jeff told police that Amanda had never been in trouble before, but then she got mixed up with drugs and then met David. She knew how scary David was. She told her friends and family that if anything were to ever happen to her, it was because David killed her. She even took out a life insurance policy. She wanted to change her life around. She wanted to go back to school and become a nurse. And Jeff says he really hopes that David gets the death penalty because no one deserves to die over some pills. And I mean, nobody deserves to be murdered for any reason when they're innocent, but I definitely understand his opinion. It does seem so senseless. Amanda had actually met with the Indiana State Police, and the information she provided was actually included in the probable cause affidavit that led to the charges against David Eisen. Amanda was not charged in connection with the murders, but she was arrested on September 30th on a felony charge of conspiracy to commit robbery, and that was in connection to the holdup at the drugstore. It seems like David's drug addiction had gotten worse and worse. Amanda went silent on her family for 6 to 8 months before the murders. She told investigators that she stayed in the car the entire time the murders occurred, and that David went to Roy's to buy pills, but that when he got back in the car, he told her that an altercation had ensued. She told investigators she was not involved and didn't even know David was armed when he went inside the trailer. On October 13, 2011, David pleaded not guilty to all 5 of the murder charges against him. He came in the court with shackles. He had a bulletproof vest on. He could be facing the death penalty because that was still on the table. But if he was convicted, he would at least get 225 to 325 years in prison anyway. And the evidence was piling up against David. And finally, on February 14th, 2012, Valentine's Day, he finally pleaded guilty. And this is because he accepted a plea deal that took the death penalty off the table in return for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Josh Napier wasn't very happy. He said, "I don't think a man who killed 5 people deserves a plea bargain." He went on to say that he has so much he wants to say. He said David's family can still visit him in prison, but I can't visit my family. He spent time in prison. Maybe it's like a second home to him. He gets 3 meals a day there. End quote. It truly doesn't seem fair, and I can see that. He also mentioned his poor niece, Sierra, who is now living with her father. She has to hold on to those horrific memories, and actually she'd been forbidden to see his family because it brought back way too much pain. So he's essentially lost that connection to his sister as well. The plea deal did mean that David had to talk. He finally tells the truth about what happened that day at the Napier's trailer. David said he was deep into his OxyContin addiction, one that came with a price. And it wasn't just paid in cash. The side effects were another price that he had to pay, one that he wasn't willing to go through. He had to get his fix, or he would physically become ill. He usually would resort to stealing pills, but when he couldn't, and he needed them badly enough, he would buy them from Roy. He said he arrived at Roy's trailer on Stipps Hill Road to buy 50 OxyContin pills. However, when he got there, Roy told him he only had 30 to sell him, and to make matters worse, Roy had increased the price of his medication from $10 a pill to $12 a pill because he lost his Medicaid insurance coverage. He was now paying out of pocket for the medication, which caused the price to increase, and David felt slighted. He felt like Roy sold some of his pills to someone else, leaving him with less than they agreed upon, and they would be more money. So they got into a very heated exchange. David said that he was like, "No, I'm not going to pay you more. I'm not going to pay you even $1 more, certainly not $2 more a pill." But Roy wouldn't back down. Then he said Melissa, Angie, and Jacob started chiming in. There's a 4-year-old present at the time, so they tell him to leave or pay up. Then finally, for whatever reason, and we will never know why, Melissa runs up to him. And that's when he decides to shoot her multiple times. But he said he already prepared at that point to take matters into his own hands because he knew he was going to get those pills. And when he saw her make her move, he pulled the trigger. He said that they'd probably have to die for him to get what he needed. David then proceeded to shoot Melissa's mom, Angie, then Roy and Jacob Napier. He had to kill them before they killed him. He wanted to make sure they were dead, so he beat them up as well. He said there was a little girl hiding in the kitchen, and he saw her as he was rummaging through all of the victims' belongings, looking for cash, pills, cell phones he could pawn. But that's when he also noticed Henry Smith inside. He had seen everything. Henry grabbed little Sierra and ran for help, and somehow he was able to get her out of there. Then he turned back to try to help the family, but David was already behind him. He caught up to Henry and he beat him in the face and then shot him in the chest to keep him from alerting anybody about what happened. I get emotional because I just can't imagine the little girl, and that this man risked his life to save the people that he knew as best friends and this little girl's life, and he died. But the way David spoke about all of this, about the way that he just callously and coldly just took these people's lives, it was just like he was talking about putting on shoes or socks. He just talked about it so heartlessly. And he acted like it was their own fault that they got killed, that he just had to do what he had to do, and they were standing in his way of his drugs. But that is how bad addiction can be. At the sentencing hearing for David Eisen in March of 2012, several members of the Napier family had the opportunity to address the court. One woman from the gallery actually shouted that David, he was wearing a bulletproof vest, deserved to die. Josh told David that he would see him in hell. Angie Napier's sister, Teresa, she condemned David. She addressed the court with a powerful statement. She said, quote, "May God have mercy on your soul." Then she went on to say that she practically raised her niece Melissa and wished she could place a picture of each of them in David's cell so he would have no choice but to look at them for the rest of his life. Last but not least, she expressed her sincere hope that the prisoners would give David the justice that he truly deserved. And I think I know what she means. David then stood before the court, saying to the judge, "I'm sorry, and I do apologize. I know me and Amanda hurt a lot of people. Unless you're doing dope like I was, shooting it 10 times a day, you don't know how it is." End quote. David's apologetic demeanor quickly changed, though. As soon as the Napier family began yelling at him, he uttered a degrading slur at one of them, and then he made an even more shocking statement. He said he had done Melissa's daughter, Sierra, a favor by killing her family. That's disgusting. The reaction was disbelief and outrage. David's words revealed a total lack of remorse and regard for his actions. And this comment obviously was met with a lot of disapproval and condemnation. Here's a clip of this.
He looks and says it was life. I got
he
life
said,
over death.
I got life over death. Was his last words to us.
How did he just stand up there being proud of what he did?
He's laughing.
He stand up and says life over death. Ha ha to the family.
He's laughing about it. Like it's something funny.
Eisen pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder in the September killings of Roy Napier, his estranged wife Angela, their adult children Melissa and Jacob, and a neighbor, Henry Smith. Police said a dispute about the quantity and price of oxycodone Eisen. Today, as Eisen left the court, he spoke for the first time to reporters and names his girlfriend Amanda Napier as an accomplice. She admitted to driving Eisen to and from the crime scene.
I'd like to say that I think Amanda should pay for her part in the crime too, and it wasn't like she said it was. It was premeditated. She was part of the plan.
Amanda would do anything for him. If he told her to get on the ground and lick the ground, she would have done it. She knew what he was doing before he went in that house. I know she did.
Josh Napier, who lost his family in one fell swoop, told reporters what he told Eisen today.
I told him I hope he burns in hell. And he will. Hopefully he has a very short, painful life.
Amanda was eventually charged as well. It turns out it was her that set up the entire drug deal. She used David's mother, Blondie's phone to text Roy. She was the one that drove David to the trailer. She waited for him. She heard the gunshots. She knew he killed them, and she drove him away from the scene as his getaway driver. Then she never reported it to the police. In 2014, Amanda Napier pleaded guilty in a Franklin County court to the charges against her. Following her plea, the judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison, with 4 years suspended. This resulted in a total of 20 years behind bars. Even David's mom was arrested. 64-year-old Berlina Blondie Richardson was also arrested for purchasing a semi-automatic firearm for her son, David. The authorities said this was not the weapons used in the murders, but nevertheless, David was not legally allowed to purchase a firearm, so his mommy did it for him and she had to pay. This whole case is extremely sad in so many ways. There's so many victims here. Victims of drug addiction, of domestic crimes as a result of that addiction, victims of murder as a result of that. Sometimes we don't realize what a little pill can do, the terrible consequences that can come from something so tiny. Addiction is not an excuse, but it's a reason why people do things they wouldn't normally do. It's true what David said to the judge. He wouldn't know what it felt like to need a drug unless we were in the same awful place of addiction that he was, but it definitely does not excuse or justify what he did in any way. It's sad because people living in rural areas don't have the money to get help most times, and a lot of times help isn't always available in these small towns. This only compounds the problem. As someone very close to addiction in ways that I'm not going to get into in this video that are very personal to me, my message is that life can get better. There are many reasons people fall into addiction: boredom, sadness, fun, and I understand it all too well. That I can't judge, but there are ways to overcome it. They won't be easy, but they are better than the terrible reality that many people who don't get help that they need have to deal with. Take it seriously. It may just be one pill or just one line, just one time, but that's all it takes. That's also why I'm going to leave resources below that can help if you are dealing with addiction or you know someone that is. Stay safe. I care about you. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.